Okay, everyone, let's start. I see that some people trickled up to the front. That's good. My name's Cliff Young, and I'm president of Ipsos Public Affairs, and I want to welcome you to our salon in our basement, but it's a very nice basement. We're taping this exercise today. And just a couple points, and I'm going to turn over to April Jeffries, who will be our moderator. The first point is salons. What are salons? Not to go into the history back into the 17th century or so, but let's just say salons are places to share ideas, a variety of ideas. They don't only have to be about one subject matter. Sometimes salons, you talk about art on the one hand and economics on the other. We're not going to quite do that. Maybe we will. We'll see. We'll riff a bit. We'll see where April goes with everything. But the point is the sharing of ideas. But more important, I made this point a number of times at these salons, is that it's a symmetric conversation. We have our specialists here. They're experts. They know a lot about the subject of today, race and ethnicity. But we don't want them so distant from you, because after we're done chatting, they're chatting and talking, everyone's going to get up and go get some drinks and some eats, and we're gonna intersperse. They'll intersperse with everyone here, and we'll keep on chatting, and that's the important point. It's not asymmetric, the conversation. Because many times these sorts of things, you have a panel, they talk and they leave, and we don't want that. We want an exchange of ideas. So that's the first point. And Ipsos, obviously, why are we doing this? We do this because we bring voice to people, to all people, to the best of our abilities, right? And we strive both on a methodological side, how to measure people's voice. We do that on the substantive side as well. And a salon is one way to do that. Experts are there to elucidate and provide context and meaning to the important issues of the day. And the point I always make is big data, a lot of data all over the place is awesome. I love data, right? But data without meaning and context means nothing. And that's what experts do. They provide us context and meaning. And the last point, obviously, when we're talking about bringing voice to the people, the peoples, all people, we're talking about the United States, we're talking about America. We can't talk about that, we can't talk about America without talking about race and ethnicity. Our own polling, our own work shows that it's hyper important for our understanding of America and the American landscape today. And without understanding it, you do not have context. You lack meaning of the subject matter at hand. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our very able April Jeffries. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Cliff. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is April Jeffries, as Cliff mentioned. I do work for Ipsos. I am the global president of our ethnography and immersive and empathy team. So I'm very excited to talk to this panel today about how race really does impact America. And I've got some questions. I hope y'all do too, because I don't understand everything, and I'm hoping that you all can help put some context around and understanding around some of what's going on in this amazing time that we live in. So let me start by introducing our guests. We have with us Russell Contreras. Russell is the Justice and Race reporter at Axios. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Russell. What would you like to tell the audience about yourself?
I'm also the co-author of Axios Latino newsletter. It comes out every Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I arrived here at midnight this morning from New Mexico. I live in the Santa Ana Pueblo Indian Reservation just north of Albuquerque, and surrounded by coyotes, bunnies, and roadrunners, so just like the Looney Tunes cartoons. And they know much about the Latino vote as some folks here in DC. So.
Okay, next we have Robert P. Jones, who's the president and founder of the Public Religious Research Institute and author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. What would you like to tell us about that?
I grew up white evangelical in Jackson, Mississippi, so that's kind of my background. But I'm now president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute. Just kind of slid over. We have a new CEO, but I'm in this capacity doing more research, and I write a regular newsletter on Substack at robertpjones.substack.com.
Great, thank you. Bobby, can I call you Bobby?
Please don't. It is way too close to Bob Jones, which in my area in religion is not really where I want to go. So Robbie is good. Yeah.
Robbie, gotcha. Okay, and then we have a couple of people here from the Brookings Institute, which is a nonprofit public policy organization based here in DC with a mission to conduct in-depth research that leads to new ideas for solving problems facing society at the local, national, and global level. We have Camille Boussette. Camille, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. It's great to be here. I just want to say that I'm really looking forward to a wonderful conversation. My own background is pretty unusual, coming to the topic of race after having done a variety of different things in the United States, but I found that ultimately this is a question we all need to grapple with in order to become a society that fully embraces everyone. So really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And joining her, we have Keon Gilbert, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow there at the Brookings Institute, yes?
Yes. Good evening. Pleasure to be here. Also a faculty member at the St. Louis University College for Public Health and Social Justice. And among some of the things I do in terms of studying the impact of racism on health, co-editor of a book, Racism, Science and Tools for the Public Health Professional.
Awesome. Great. Well, we're going to jump right into this because we don't have time and I want to get to the good stuff very quickly. So first, let's just talk about this polarization that is happening here in America. And it's interesting because when I say that, I can't just say there's two Americas, right? Every time I turn the kaleidoscope a little bit, the polarization looks a little bit different, but it also seems to cross partisan lines very much so, right? So my question for you is, as we look at some of these divisions that have started, do you think that the heat of all this racial division is coming from us, from the bottom up? Or do you think it's more of a political thing from the top down that's causing us to feel the way we feel and do some of the things that we're doing here?
I would say it's got deep historic ties that Robert talks about in his book when he's talking about the origins of racism in white Christianity or white evangelical churches that we have not addressed. We're at a moment right now where they're finally festering. We're being honest about the discussions. We have the most educated population that we've ever had. And yet there's this push by certain segments of our political spectrums that are saying we're all being woke for the ride. We're too woke for the ride. But apparently we have no problem being asleep at the wheel. This is a problem when when voices of color are actually saying we have grievances here that we need to talk about. We need to talk about the legacy of slavery. We need to talk about the removal of Native people and Mexican people from their lands. And having that discussion where we're finally coming to terms with violence and lynchings and other episodes that we have never talked about, there is a push to say, you're going too far. Why are you bringing this up now? Well, we couldn't bring it up in 1930 because we risked violence then. And so all this is festering when we look at our criminal justice system, our education system, and we now have an educated Latino intelligentsia. The black intelligentsia is no longer the talented 10th, it's the talented 30th. And I think that this group is now articulating things that the country is uncomfortable talking about. And instead of embracing it and having an honest conversation, they're basically saying, get back in the car, go back to sleep, we got this. And I don't think that's gonna happen anymore.
Any thoughts?
Right down the line. Well, I'll just set the table with a couple of stats that, since I'm a numbers guy, that stay with me a lot and kind of help me understand the big picture. I just pick up on your, like, why now, right? Why are we seeing the kind of visceral reactions around race, around America, who counts as an American, who is an American, like these big questions of American identity. why now are we seeing the kind of reactions? And I think one of the biggest reasons is that we're experiencing vast demographic change in the country. But if you put a particular lens on it, if you put an ethno-religious lens on it, a cultural lens on it, I think it tells a different story than just the pure demographic lens that we get from the census. So one that I use a lot is realizing that we have become, for the first time in our country's history, a country that is no longer a majority white Christian country. Right, so we have moved just from, if you just go back to 2008 when Barack Obama was first running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. So if you put all white Christians together, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, et cetera, 54% white and Christian. Today that number is 44%, right? So we have crossed this threshold just at the coincidental point of having the symbolic first African-American president in the White House, right? And I sometimes only half-jokingly talk about, like, what we're experiencing is essentially a great white Christian freakout moment, right? And that's really, to put it in technical terms, what's going on, right? But I think it is this shift. So even if people don't know those statistics, they can look down the pew, and what they see is white Christians, Protestant and Catholic, shrinking in numbers. And the way that individuals experience that is that their kids and their grandkids aren't in the pews, right, in the way that they were, and the average age is ticking up. So as white Christian groups are shrinking, they're graying, and I think there's a kind of writing on the wall. And so when we heard these appeals from former President Trump in 2016, look, if you don't elect me, this is your last chance, folks. He was saying that on the stump, especially to white Christian audiences in 2016. I think that has really set the table for why what seems to kind of like desperate, visceral kinds of reactions that we're seeing in the public right now.
Yeah, there's triggers, right? There's these and in this world of sound bites, right? There's all these little triggering sound bites that we have. Even the word racism, and certainly racist, oh my God, don't call me a racist, right? That seems to trigger some deep emotions with people. Can you help understand what is the emotional thing going on here? Where is it really coming from? Because it crosses all sides, right? Where's the triggering coming from? What's causing it?
So I think this is a really extraordinary historical moment, and I wanted just to agree with everything that my colleagues have said up to this point. I also think one of the things that's triggering, the reason some of these words and phrases are particularly triggering is because when they are becoming more frequently used and just becoming more normalized, it also signals tremendous change. And for people who are white and not doing well, particularly economically, they're not just seeing the sort of demographic shift in the pews, but they are also feeling diminished because their reference points have changed, right? Because in the past, they could always point to poor blacks or Latinos as somebody who's doing worse than they are. And that reference point may be changing. And so as a result, the idea that we start to talk about racism, about structural racism, about a range of categories that suggest that we need to change the order, that becomes particularly threatening.
Other thoughts, Karen?
Sure. One of the things that's very apparent is the legacy of white supremacy and how it is.
That's one of those triggers, by the way. White
Absolutely.
supremacy. They don't like that.
Not at all, not at all. But the ways that it sort of reforms and reshapes itself in many parts and sectors of our society, of our community, of our institutions. One of the things that we can even think about is sort of even the definition of race, and the census actually has done a little bit of work in identifying sort of the changing of who has been able to be counted as white over time. And that's really important to think about in terms of how we consider and factor in these demographic shifts across the country. And the fears that are sort of coming up that many people have already mentioned in terms of what's going to happen. And part of that is the disconnect that we experience in our communities, because as Camille was talking about, as the reference points changes, or the referent groups, or the images, or the ideas of who I can compare myself to, either better or worse, people are afraid in terms of who's going to be in charge and may have control over what happens in their lives, their health decisions, their ability to take sick leave, all of these sort of very important policies that people care about on a day-to-day basis, in addition to sort of larger policies. And so part of that fear and concern is thinking about there's gonna be this other person that I don't know, that I don't identify with, that may be making decisions about me that you know, are gonna hurt me in some kind of way.
Well, that's interesting because I might argue that for white people, they never had to face that, but for Black and Latino and Asian people, that's kind of always been the case, right? So is it really just coming from one side versus the other, or?
I think some of it is coming largely from one side versus others, because as you mentioned, groups that have been racialized, minoritized, have always had that experience. But I do think part of the awakening or the wokeness, as we can see in sort of some of the exit polls and looking at some of the groups that have sort of really sort of honed in voting for Democrats, been a lot more younger people, especially young white women in particular. And as they start to see policies and people making decisions about them that don't reflect them or have their experiences, they're making other decisions. We've largely discounted minority and racialized groups, as well as even young people, for decades. And many of them are wanting to find their place, and part of how they're trying to find their place is the ways that they're voting.
It's interesting, some of the work we've been doing has shown that young people ain't putting up with that, right? They've got a whole nother thing going on. So let's unpack that a little bit. Russell, talk about the Latino vote and how that seems to be changing, because I've seen a lot of Latino boxes being checked as white now, as opposed to before it didn't used to do that as much. So what's happening within that community that's really changing some of how they're thinking?
Well, I would start off let's go all the way back to 1960 when John F. Kennedy ran for president. That's the first time a president ever reached out and considered and identified the Latino vote, and he won 90% of the vote. It's been going down ever since for Democrats. It went down with LBJ, and then Nixon got some. And so now I think the threshold is about 62-38, 62 Democrats, 38 Republicans, and it could be at 60-40. We don't know the new benchmark, depending on what exit polls you believe. But the census, the recent census, did allow Latinos options to how to identify. Before, that was not an option. Latinos had to identify as white. I never did. I always picked up Native American or wrote something else because I never had that experience. And I think with the rise of evangelical Christianity amongst Latinos, and seeing this in Robbie's book, that the number of Latinos embracing evangelicalism is at a rise and growing every year. But they're embracing, many of them embracing a sort of type of Christianity that is seeped in white supremacy. So they're accepting the idea of racialized whiteness, especially if it's all there. It's already cooked for them. All you have to do is put it in the oven and eat it. And I think that's what's going on. At the same time, there is another group of folks that are saying, I'm embracing my indigenous heritage. I'm embracing my Afro-Latino heritage. One of the things we pointed out in Axios Latino is I did see a story from the Associated Press that said this World Series was the first time we didn't have any US-born Black players playing. But when I turned on the World Series, all I saw were Black players. They were just from Latin America. They were Afro-Latinos. So it did not look like Jackie Robinson, yes, but it looked like Roberto Clemente. That Afro-Latinidad is something we rarely talk about. And I think now with the picking of the census, we can point out, yes, there are some Latinos that are embracing whiteness, but there are also some others that are embracing something else. And I think this is reflection of our own divisions in the rest of the country. It is now being reflected among Latinos too.
So does that lead to colorism of some kind?
Oh yeah, no, it means colorism all the time. And if I happen to spend too much time out in the summer and in the sun, and if I throw myself up as some other folks, I will get looks and kind of comments that I've embraced my Aztec heritage somehow. There were points, honestly, where I was too dark at one point, and a Latina I was dating did not want to bring me home to her mother because it would have been an embarrassment. But I also point out, as this intelligentsia grows. We are embracing this deep, complicated history. For those who are Mexican American, we are coming to terms that we may have been in part, or played a role in the Underground Railroad to Mexico. If you were an enslaved person in Texas, you did not go north, you went south. And what we're finding out is there were a lot more people that did so, and not only were we connected in some sort of conductor, we also are connected biologically and spiritually. And I think a lot of people are having a problem with that.
Interesting. So let's talk about the spiritually part for a minute, because I feel like religion shows up in words in hidden ways, right? They talk about values and tradition. Somehow religion is baked into that. So can you help me understand, has that term been co-opted? Are we using that somehow to our advantage or disadvantage? What's happening with that?
We're talking in general now, that word? Yeah. I mean, one of my pet peeves as someone who studies religion is reporters using the word people of faith, right? Or religious voters, as if something like that exists in the world, right? We have varieties of religious voters, we have varieties of religious faith, and since this conversation is about race, most of the time when they are using that word, it's white people they're talking about, right? They've just screened out all people of color. So you hear like an interview with Ralph Reed on NPR where he just talked about people of faith oppose abortion, right? And it just went by, right, without any real challenge. And so one of the things I keep pointing out in the religious landscape that's really interesting today is that we have this polarization. We're talking about political polarization, but we have this religious polarization that's happening along racial and religious lines in the country. With essentially what's happening is white evangelical voters are drifting further and further from mainstream Americans, and they're bringing with them Latino Protestants as that group is growing, as well as still a little bit, maybe 4% of the country, Latino Protestants, so it's not huge, but it's growing. So that's the thing to kind of keep an eye on. But there's a big gulf between those folks and all other Christians and non-religious Americans who make up a quarter of the country. So like thinking about even the word like people of faith, like it's much more accurate, for example, to say majorities of people of faith support the legality of abortion. Majorities of people of faith support marriage equality. Like those things are true from the data, right? But we have this kind of outdated mode of thinking about, people of faith or values voters, whatever that ever meant, right? That I think is sort of outdated. It feels like holdovers to me from insisting that, like, from the 1980s, right, kind of the Christian right movement in the 1980s, still trying to assert itself with that rhetoric.
Yeah, and there's some contradiction in there too, right? Like, how does that rhetoric play with guns and that stuff, right? Is it different? How do you justify that? I'm not sure who's the best person to answer that question.
I actually want to go back to the discussion about Latino voters and the ways in which things have changed with them. So I think the first thing to recognize is that this is not a monolithic group, obviously. And like most of the groups we talk about, they're not monolithic. So Latinos who have been in what is now the United States, but were there, their families were there before the United States, became, absorbed them, like in Texas, et cetera, will have a different kind of viewpoint of what is important to them, different political priorities. People who are more newly arrived and maybe from Central America or from Mexico and live in LA will have, a different viewpoint as well. Cuban Americans will be different, Puerto Ricans will be different, Dominicans, et cetera. So it's a really broad range of people with different kinds of political priorities. And what we have found in the research that has been done by my colleagues at Brookings is that when we think about the Latino vote, the most important people to focus on are Latinas. They are the ones who are really participating and much more active, and they are the ones for whom the issues can change depending upon, their particular priorities. So for instance, in this last midterm election, for them, everybody would think that Latinos are mostly concerned about immigration, et cetera. But actually, they were concerned more about bread and butter issues, and about guns and child safety, et cetera. So to get back to your question, around guns, this is becoming an issue that isn't just, you know, the purview of white America, but it's also being considered in a variety of other communities as well.
Makes sense. Any thoughts on that? No more? Did you say? No, I'm good. So, okay, so that's, we talked about the Latino vote and how that's working. Let's break out the African-American issues and things that are going on here. So, Black Lives Matter. It was really, really big in 2020. Everybody was marching. We were all doing all kinds of things. And now, what's happened with that? Is it still as prominent? Has it softened? Has it died down? What are we doing?
It's a great question. I think in terms of the organization itself, there's been issues and challenges that have been covered in the news. But in terms of the ideas, the rhetoric, many of the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement, they're still present and prominent in the thoughts of many communities. In particular, our failures to pass a number of criminal justice reforms, police reforms, at federal levels. Also, as we think about sort of the changing demographics of American people, even thinking about how to embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever that looks like, that is also starting to take shape in very different and interesting ways. And I think in some ways it's repeating previous patterns where there's been a movement sort of post-affirmative action to think about how do we diversify schools, especially colleges and universities, how do we diversify the workplace in a number of different ways. And I think that's going to look a little bit different as we move further and further away from 2020, from the death of George Floyd, from declarations of racism as a public health crisis as another example. And many entities, many institutions still find it very challenging to change. And I think that's another lasting impact of structural racism, is that institutions themselves find it very hard for them to change. And in part, that continues to reproduce racism in many different ways, through our institutions, through policies, even religious institutions as well. Many people struggle with identifying with a particular faith tradition or certain institutions because of inherent discrimination in those institutions. And I think the more that we think about how the Black Lives Matter movement sort of introduced new ways of thinking about reform, thinking about abolishing police departments, thinking about further, not just Black Lives Matter, thought about abolishing prisons, but it sort of continued some of that conversation that many people like Angela Davis started a long time ago. And so as we rethink how institutions need to operate and function to better serve and meet the needs of communities, I think that's part of sort of the centrality of what's happened and what we should learn from the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, it's interesting. Russell, you said something to me the other day that was about how it has to change, right? You said this is not just a nice to do, this is something that we have to do based on the way the world is changing. But it doesn't seem like organizations are really moving that way. And I can speak for business as well, just even with a lot of my clients. And the reason I know it hasn't happened is that if a business was really focused against a problem, they get it done. But it's not getting done. So what's happening, Russell? Like, what is it that we're not saying or that we're not embracing within these organizations that you think we haven't necessarily believed that there's something better in it for us all?
Well, I think, like the church, we have to come and be honest about the legacy of white supremacy. We cannot do a couple of catchphrases and a couple of slogans and hold a press conference and say we're donating this amount to HBCUs or we're donating this amount for scholarships. There has to be a concerted effort. But I think as groups like this have struggled over the time, the movement has shaped itself in different forms. And what I see is the coalitions that are built out of the Black Lives Matter movement with Mexican Americans and Native Americans have been new urban coalitions that have formed and rural coalitions that have formed, and we're starting to see change. Think about this. For the first time in American history, our 4 major cities right now are run by Black mayors: New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago. And all of them were elected, got the vote, partly with a large portion of Latino voters. In 3 of those cities, it was Mexican-American voters. This is a coalition has deep roots going all the way back from Barbara Jordan in Houston and Harold Washington in Chicago. When these coalitions came together during the pandemic with Black Lives Matter, they reconstituted themselves. They became younger. They became having other conversations outside of police brutality. They started talking about the educational system. So we kind of ignored it because we were so preoccupied with the pandemic and police reform that we kind of took our eyes off the ball of other things that were going on. And I think we're starting to see that, and I don't know where that's going to go. When I go and talk to folks as voters and as a reporter, I'm starting to see some bubbling of conversations that were happening after the Kerner report. And I happen to live by Fred Harris, the former senator, one of the last surviving members of the Kerner report. And our last conversation a couple of months ago, he was excited, where people were dejected, and they thought that the election was going to go a certain way, and some of the reforms were no longer obtainable. He was energetic. He says, this reminds me of that moment in time of 1968 that I thought we were going to get reformed. When Robert Kennedy was running, and I was excited, and we had the Kerner Commission report, and we knew LBJ wasn't going to fund it. But that moment now, I'm starting to see something going on, and I don't know where it's going to end. So he was less pessimistic and more optimistic. And I don't know if I share that view, but I find it very interesting that this older guy from a previous generation did.
Interesting. But, so,
Can I add just one quick thing?
Yeah, sure.
So it was making me think about, from an attitudinal point of view, maybe one piece of good news here is that one of the hardest things for, let's put it bluntly, white people to see is systemic racism, right? Virtually invisible, I think, from that standpoint many times. And one of the things we've seen in the data since 2015 is this alignment with white Democrats and white college-educated Americans with African Americans on the issue of structural racism, and particularly the treatment of African Americans by police. So we've been asking a question about, longstanding question we've asked, puts it this way: do you think the killing of African Americans by, unarmed African Americans by police is part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans, or do you think they're just isolated incidents, right? And so this kind of choosing, it's just kind of these one-off bad apples, or no, it's a systemic pattern of how police treat African Americans. And in 2015, there was about a 12-point gap between white Democrats and non-white Democrats on this statement. And over time, that gap has actually closed. So it's kind of been this kind of realignment of white Democrats and mostly white college-educated Americans. White non-college-educated Americans and white Republicans have not moved on this. So it's been a kind of partial realignment. But I think that's notable and something that I think is quite significant to kind of pay attention to.
April, I want to jump in here for a second and just chat a little bit about why we might not be seeing the kind of changes, which your original question was. So, and I think Robbie's done some work on this too, but social networks that people are embedded in take a long time to change as well. We've done some research that really shows that relative to getting a job or an educational opportunity, or looking for a housing opportunity, that the kind of networks within which people are embedded tend to be racially homogenous. And so that does make it much more difficult for people to be much more mainstreamed, for people of color to be much more mainstream, because the resources and information that are important to moving ahead are actually flowing within racial groups and not between them. So I know Robbie's done some interesting research on how you change minds around that as well, but I do think that's an important part of the puzzle, and why even with the business community investing in various initiatives, when at the end of the day everybody goes home, those social networks are pretty racially homogenous.
so you've done work on how to change that. How do you change it?
Well, one way we change it is we've got to figure out ways to build institutions that put people together across these lines. And where we did some research on people's core friendship networks. And these are people, not just that you rub shoulders with at work, but that you actually talk about your personal life with. That's how we defined it. And you've talked something about your personal life in the last 12 months. And basically we found in 2013, we first did this work, that the average core friendship network of your average white person was 91% white. We did it again this past year, hasn't moved, right? So despite some of this thing, we still, in our social worlds and friendships, where these things, these conversations about, how do you, there's social knowledge, there's social capital, that happens in these circles. It's not just about friendships, but the other thing we found though, and this is I think the good news, if we can figure out how to build these bridges, is that the presence of one non-white person in a white person's social network made a difference of about 15 percentage points on a whole range of questions that had to do with immigration, American identity, racism, and the like. So just one person, being there makes a huge difference.
That is amazing to me. All you need is the story of one person, right, to make a friend. So let's all go make a friend with someone that's different than us.
If I could add just a couple of things. In some of my work with thinking about social capital, social networks, one of the interesting things about our networks is that they also have health impacts. And part of that is thinking about our patterns of segregation. And so not only where people live, but where people work, where people worship, and thinking about how those individual contexts also raise particular risks for health. And so in some of the work that I've done of sort of thinking about cardiovascular risk for Black men, workplace is actually one of those contexts, one of those places that increases Black men's risk for cardiovascular disease. And so when we think about sort of what happens within the context of a workplace, especially in particular types of work environments or occupations, there's a lot of variation in autonomy in those various occupations and spaces, and how that increases opportunities for Black men to be discriminated against. And then when they go home to segregated neighborhoods, they're also facing other forms of discrimination because many of them are living in neighborhoods and contexts where there aren't full-service grocery stores, there aren't sidewalks to be physically active, and then they are also hyper-policed. And so when we think about even this idea of networks and how people interact and engage in various spaces and where those networks are, we also have to think about sort of what are some of these other effects.
It's deep, and they were all created in this systemic racist thing, right, that just kept going. I'm gonna back up a little. Let's talk about the midterms. What's happening in Georgia, y'all?
So I want to say, I want to provide an observation which I think is going to be a little bit provocative, which is that you have two very different candidates. Herschel Walker was selected by the Republican Party to represent them, and I think in a very cynical way. Once they knew, obviously that Warnock was running, they're like, I think the thought process was, let's just find another Black person, another Black man, and somebody with some name recognition, and let's put a lot of money behind him, and then we'll have two Black people running against each other, and it'll be hard for people to make a choice. And Herschel Walker has better name recognition in rural Georgia than Raphael Warnock does. I think it was really cynical, and I think that's come back to bite the Republican Party in a very in a kind of unanticipated way. Not only because Herschel Walker is a flawed candidate, but because I think it demonstrated that level of cynicism within the Republican Party to people who are urban voters. So I think there's several layers there. It's not just Herschel Walker versus Warnock, but it's also about how the Republican Party thinks about its own, how it thinks about voters in Georgia. And I think that selection of Herschel Walker says a lot about that.
Interesting. Other thoughts on that race?
Well, in that race, I think it's a microcosm of the whole midterms that we just went through, and I think there's an attempt for both parties to do some corrections in the way they were running this past race, to say we don't want to make the same mistakes in this short period of time. Whether that is successful or not remains to be seen. But I will say one of the things I noticed in the midterms is a narrative of this Latino shift. I don't think it's a realignment, but I think it's this gradual shift. The evidence is clear, no matter what pundits say, that when you take the polls we've done at Ipsos, it's clear that Latinos see Republicans in general as being racist. They've said racist things, they've said things like there's an invasion. Those are triggering words that go back generations, and people say that's racist. Democrats, however, they see them, they'll say, well, they're condescending. They're always coming up here us and playing the wrong music or suggesting that I'm the only option, right? So they get, if you look at parts of New Mexico and rural Texas, they're getting very pissed off at this. Even as simple as playing salsa in a place that loves Tejano music, it's ridiculous. So you put a racist and a condescending person there, it becomes a wash. The issues are the economy and gun violence. We see the Republicans do well. So voters are saying, okay, you two are clown. What else do you have for me? And they start making these decisions on those bread and butter issues. And that's when Republicans do well, when it's not a national race, when you can localize it. And I'm starting to see more of that. And some Republicans have been telling me privately, that's the where we want to go. We need to get away from this clown show that's going on nationally and focus on back to what George W. Bush did in the early 2000s. That's where we were successful. That's where we got our biggest gains with Hispanics, especially Mexican American. And I think my colleague's right. This is not a monolith, but I want to point out the Mexican American vote is very different than the Cuban American vote. And let me let in a little secret. These two groups tend to not like each other. They're the Israelis and Palestinians of Latinos. We never say it. And organizations that form themselves on the Latino vote talk about unity because they want to keep getting funding from folks to say we want a one-stop shop for you just to go get them out to vote and be quiet. But no, you put them in a room together, they're going to kill each other. Yes, on one-on-one, they're cool. But, and it makes sense. Cuban Americans came into the country with a different immigration path that was welcoming. Mexican Americans had 3 mass deportations. There is resentment there. And I think when you look at it, and if you look at polling, you have to understand why Florida's going one way and California's going another.
If I could just make a quick comment about Georgia. I agree with Camille about it being cynical. And I think I extend that in terms of thinking about the selection of Herschel Walker is also an extension of white supremacy in many different ways, in terms of picking this particular black man who represents many tropes and stereotypes of black men. I think it was in part an appeal to black men in Georgia. The idea that you sort of pick this athlete who was very successful in sports and having him as a figure and recognizing that there were a number of black men who voted for Trump, trying to pick up on some of that in many different ways. And so I think that's problematic in its own way, but in some ways one could even argue genius on the part of Republicans to some extent. But it's also really threatening, and also because recent conversations, I think in particular Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz were in Georgia last week, and they were really trying to create this, sort of racial identity politics by suggesting that Herschel Walker was a real black man and Raphael Warnock was not, because of the positionality and the images that sort of both of them evoke and imagine. And so when you even think about the challenge of that, Raphael Warnock is pastor of, one of the most famous churches in the U.S., and that is also a place and space where all politicians want to go to try to attract black voters. And so now it's being discounted as an important space and place.
Very interesting. So I want to wrap this up with a positive question. Because I do think that there's an opportunity now, right, as you described, Russell, about, hey, maybe there's a renaissance going on now that we really can take advantage to make some positive change. So, what can we do to put the lens on that helps us to see how to make some real impact and change in some of the things we're doing? Any thoughts?
Go first, Rob.
You first, Robbie.
Oh, man, I got to tell you, I'm not that hopeful. Sorry about that. Yeah, but I have a hard time getting there. I mean, here's what I think. I think ultimately, if I'm going to say something hopeful, ultimately, I do believe we're going to get there. I'm not a demographics as destiny kind of guy, but I think there's enough positive work being done in enough positive places. And where I find hope, if I'm looking at it, I find hope in local communities on the ground with what's happening. There is some positive things happening with local communities on the ground. I've probably spoken, for example, to, I don't know, 80 white Christian churches who are trying to have the conversation about Black Lives Matter and racism and their place in it. And that's something I frankly haven't seen before these last 2 years. So if I'm going somewhere hopeful, that's where I find hope that's happening on the ground. But I got to say, well, the one place I do despair about Georgia a bit, and I despair from a perspective of democracy here. He's such a flawed candidate, Walker, right? And I think what it really shows us is that, I mean, political scientists talk about asymmetric polarization, right? And this idea that what we have so far, or so much of, is not that we love our own party, but it's that we so hate the other party, right? That's what's driving it, right? So it's not necessarily love for Herschel Walker, but it is intense hatred, right? And think about who this is directed against. Like as you said, it's like Raphael Warnock, who stands in the pulpit of Martin Luther King Jr.'s father's pulpit, right? That's what we're talking about, right? And that anything else stacked up against that seems a better option than that. That's a tough place for us to be.
Maybe I'll pick up a little bit on the part about communities. So when I'm in St. Louis, hanging out in barbershops, talking to Black men and Black families about health and well-being, and a number of different issues, I think one of the most important things that people want is a new narrative about themselves, about their communities. Communities are used to talking about problems, issues, and challenges. What they're not seeing is change. And so part of that change is thinking about new narratives, thinking about how to radically imagine their communities, their workplaces, their churches, schools for their children, opportunity. And the more that we focus on changing the narrative, that also, I think, helps to think about new strategies or reforming or reframing existing strategies. And I think that gets us also to a different place in terms of policy making at the local level, county, state, federal as well, where we truly do understand the needs of communities. And politicians and political groups do more than what they're currently doing in the ways that they're engaging them. Both sides are horrible at engaging communities. Researchers like us, we're horrible at engaging communities. And they know that, and the communities are talking about that, and I think they're talking about it even more. And I think some of that is very apparent in terms of the ways that people even rejected the idea of a COVID vaccine, in terms of saying, well, we're not interested in taking something that hasn't been sort of tested or involved or engaged with us. And so when we think about that as an example, you have to really think about or reimagine how are we going to engage communities in appropriate ways.
Yeah. So what can we as researchers do better? You talked about researchers not really engaging.
So it's a great question. So, there's lots of models for how do we engage communities. In public health, we call it community-based participatory research. Other groups call it participatory action research. So whatever your model is, you really have to sort of think about how do you engage a particular community, whether it's geographically sort of defined, whether it's a community-based organization or a coalition, thinking about the strategies that you're using and thinking about, are those the appropriate strategies, and asking the community to reflect on that and to help you create new strategies. Part of it is also our institutions. So I'm at Brookings, I'm also at St. Louis University, and sometimes our institutional policies really don't support the idea of engaging communities because of the power imbalances. So if you take big institution university, big institution Brookings or whatever it is, we're interested in keeping the money in particular. And so not sharing resources in equal ways or other types of ways with community-based organizations becomes really important to think about as a strategy. The NIH is actually doing something new recently in terms of giving funding directly to community-based organizations. And so, of course, there's going to be stipulations and rules and ways that those organizations have to receive funds or are able to receive funds. But then there are also smaller examples. And so I'm working with a group in St. Louis. They have a racial healing and justice fund. And their goal is to give funds directly to community-based organizations. And even if they're small organizations, they're trying to find and identify fiscal partners so that they have a fiscal agent to help them manage as the organization itself builds its capacity to be able to be its own fiscal agent. And just another quick example, a lot of municipalities are even sort of testing these ideas called participatory budgeting, where council members are sort of setting aside a certain percentage or a small amount of their budgets and asking communities to give input about how to utilize those resources. So those are other types of things that we can do. Sometimes they make a very small change, but part of it is recognizing and acknowledging the input and the value of community members. Yeah. And so that's sort of the beginning point, and then you sort of just blossoms and grows from there.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to give the audience a chance to ask you guys some questions. So somebody gonna help me with that? You can use mine. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, hello. I wanted to address something that Robert said, and that is, for the first time, the U.S. is experiencing demographic change. I don't think that's entirely accurate, because I think if you look at like pre-colonization, it was a minority-majority country, right? Like, it's not, hey, you know, people of color are outnumbering white people for the first time. It's people of color outnumbering white people for at least the second time, right? It's, I don't know, I just wanted to bring it up and see, like, how you feel about it, how other people may feel about it, how, like, we sometimes tend to forget that, like, oh, yeah, you know, there were people here, and then white people came and sort of took a lot from them, and, yeah, just wanted to raise that point, maybe.
No, so I really appreciate that. I actually spent most of my afternoon writing about the Dawes Act. Okay. Today, so I was like deeply enmeshed in this whole the question. So I think, yeah, in the context of my comments, I really appreciate you saying that. That certainly going back, you know, prior, my next book actually is connecting up the Black Lives Matter story to pre-Republic, going all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493, right? Nice. And because I think that in many ways is the roots of really this ethno-religious idea that Christianity and civilization, right, was what Europeans were bringing to the country. And by the way, just one more stat I'll throw out. This is still with us today, right? This idea that America is a promised land for European Christians. We actually asked a question about this in our last survey. 30% of the country agrees with this. The majority of Republicans agree with this, and half of white evangelicals agree with that statement, that America was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians. Like, that goes way back to, that's what Columbus got secured when he went back to Spain in 1493, and it is still embedded in white Christian consciences today. So, thank you.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
So kind of taking us back to one of your original questions, one thing that I've been looking at is polarization. As we become more polarized, has that essentially let politicians off the hook? Because it seems like as we become more polarized, they've been able to take less stances on real issues because they're mainly inflaming either side. And the question then, kind of to your original, does that start at the grassroots? Does the solution start? Does the solution start up here? Do you think there's merit to that to begin with?
Well, you know, I think it's interesting. The way our political system works is that it tends to favor small rural places that tend to be mostly white at this point. So if that's your constituency, right, then it makes sense for you to inflame that, I mean, as a political survival strategy. Whereas if you're from some kind of urban place, you clearly will have a different kind of engagement strategy. So I don't think we don't want to leave things up to politicians. I think it's going to be really important for Americans, particularly young Americans, to be very, very involved in voting and in making choices, policy choices that can maybe alter that power balance that we have between rural and urban areas.
And I can say, as a member of the media, I can say our industry is partly responsible because we've created an ecosystem where politicians who have good sound bites are rewarded. Politicians who can pop off on Twitter are rewarded. I could always tell someone who's popping off on Twitter if they're reading books or not, because they're constantly going to Twitter and just popping off on the stupidest shit. And as a result, they're not reading position papers. They're not learning their history, and they're going. And I can say, not to sound like our former president, but both sides do this, because I have noticed that those that get rewarded are those looking for likes and retweets rather than solutions. And if we look back just on the issue of immigration, we've been debating this since the 90s, like saying, hey, we need to amend the 1986 law that was passed by Reagan, or the amnesty law, and we haven't done anything since. And I think as long as there's an impasse, there remains power in those sound bites and the dumb stuff that both sides can say, accusing the others of being racist or anti-American, so forth and so on. And that furthers the polarization. And I think as a result, we become alienated, that we say, okay, with this is not a system I want to engage with. But there's something else happening. You mentioned, where do I see hope? One of the things I do when I get depressed, and I do what my relatives, men in my family did for years. I usually drink. But one place I go to is, there's a place in New Mexico, it's a taco truck, and it's called the Blaxican Taco Truck. And it's run by a black man and his Mexican wife. And in this place is this, in the middle of the desert, right there on native land, people from all over get together and engage. And the last time I was there, I was talking to a young Navajo woman who was pregnant from a guy who she started dating. They met during a Black Lives Matter protest. So there's something else going on here that I can't define. I don't even know what's happening, and it'll be years for us to be able to decipher, but something is bubbling, and I think we haven't noticed it yet.
So there's a gentleman over there that's been waiting. Here. Go ahead. And then we have 1, 2, 3. We have time. A little more, 5. Maybe someone,
One question, or I guess one group I was sort of thinking about as we talked about what is like the inability to see sort of the systemic problems, or sort of the contrast between the, I guess the races of the Republican Party and the condensation of the Democratic Party, was non-college educated and lower income white people. Throughout the history of the country, they've sort of been, outside of Reconstruction, they've been a group that's kind of been in the middle, where it's like, you're better than them, like black people or Latinos or other minority groups, but you're not us, sort of wealthy white people. And I guess the question I have is, how do you sort of break through to that group and get them to see some of the problems without coming across as condescending? Especially, like, I see it, especially from the Democratic Party, when it comes to, like, white privilege, because it's hard to sell someone that lives paycheck to paycheck that they have privilege, and it's hard to get them to see those problems. So I guess what are certain things you've seen among that group? And not to brand them as a monolith, because they're obviously, different sections.
So I think that's a really interesting question. A couple of years ago, I led a conversation between William Julius Wilson, who's a very renowned sociologist, a black sociologist, and J.D. Vance, who we now know is moving off to the Senate. And it was actually a conversation about what are the similarities between growing up low income and black and low income and white in these kind of sort of depopulated areas, that, for instance, J.D. Vance comes from. And what was really interesting about that conversation is they both ended up talking about how frayed social networks really have left people feeling very, very isolated, and have left people feeling kind of unmoored politically. And so I think there's a kind of, there's a common experience there that I think we can access. And if we're able to access that, I think that is a starting point.
Well, I'll just say one quick note about that. So these are my people. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. My parents were both the first in their family to go to college. My dad did that by 15 years of night school. So, this is the world in which I grew up. And what's interesting about it, I think, is that culturally speaking, I think the narrative that kept coming through to us is still this idea of chosenness, right? That was so deep with us, right? So that there was this sense of like, we're not them, we're not black, we're not Latino, we're not, whatever. And this sense of kind of chosenness, even as, we were on the south side of town, going to rundown schools. The schools I went to, my high school was built in 1915 and never been renovated since You couldn't even write on the chalkboards at my public school because they were so worn out, and they were also this high off the ground because it was built as an elementary school. But there was still this sense though of kind of the hand of God, right, and this kind of chosenness, and this land after all was for you, right, and so I think there was this. And I think letting go of that is actually one of the hardest things going on right now. And right, that's one of the biggest challenges that white people are having to face, white Christian people in particular are having to face, I've described it as kind of like, from feeling like you're the head of the, those kind of old tables that have like what calls the captain's chair with the arms on it, where the father sat at the end of the table presiding over dinner. I mean, I think we built that into our furniture, for God's sake, right? But this sense that that's what the country was. Like, we were sitting in this captain's chair, inviting everybody else politely to come up and playing host, but realizing, like, no, we don't own that table, and we have to pull up a chair along with everybody else. I think that's one of the challenging things. One phrase, I'll just leave this with you, that came over and over again post-Reconstruction was this phrase called, we have the bottom rail on top. All right, it's a fencing metaphor, all right, that with a top rail and a bottom rail, right? And white people were the top rail and everybody else was the bottom rail. And the sense that after Reconstruction, those got flipped, right? That there was a kind of ordered nature to things. And I think we're still coming to grips, I think, with that.
Hi. First of all, thank you all for taking the time to come speak to us today. So a question that's on my mind, given that we are talking about race and discourse within that in America, is when it comes to Asian American discourse, and how in the past 3 years, with the rise of anti-Asian hate and other such things, when it comes to COVID and stuff like that, how that's picked up by significant tech. But then if we look beyond that, even further into the past, there's always been a long history of the othering of Asian Americans. Now, as an Indian American myself, and someone who identifies as Indian Catholic, this is something I felt personally. And what I'd be interested in learning from you is, where do you really see the voices of Asian Americans kind of being included into sociopolitical discourse here? Because if you really look at any social or political circle, be it religious or government or otherwise, the voices of Asian Americans in that is usually seen as an afterthought. It usually goes Black and Latino voices first, and then Asian American voices second. And so I'm very curious to see is like what your perspectives on that are, and where do you see the development of that going?
Such a great question, and thank you for that. So I'm originally from California, from the Bay Area. Same. So, great. I'm so glad we are here together. And as you know, very, very large kind of pan-Asian presence in that area, and as a result, elected officials, lots of powerful CEOs, et cetera, are of, Asian background. And so when I look at California, to me, I'm looking at the future of the nation, and I really think that we already have a blueprint for that. That said, however, COVID and even pre-COVID, there's just always been, I think, an undercurrent, and this has been for hundreds of years, right? Undercurrent of anti-Asian hate. We have a number of laws on the books, actually, sort of anti-Chinese laws, and obviously we had Japanese internment camps, et cetera. So we have a pretty robust history of anti-Asian hate that's actually been officially sanctioned, right? So I think there's a lot more we can be doing there, but I'm hoping that as the demographic shift, as the kind of economic power of various Asian communities becomes greater, that we'll be able, Asians will become a very important part of our democratic conversation.
I would say that one of the things that was opening my eyes during COVID, as we started seeing anti-Asian hate, was as we looked at some of the data from California, that Asian Americans were becoming victims by other people of color. That for people of color, we embrace this legacy of white supremacy, and we're taking it out on Asian Americans. And analyzing the data, it was hard for us to have those conversations because we wanted to say, oh no, this is just white people beating up on Asian Americans, and that wasn't the case. There's a deep anti-Asian sentiment among Latinos. There's a deep anti-Asian sentiment among African Americans. And there's a deep anti-Asian American sentiment on the creation of this country. If you look up the formation of the Border Patrol, it was created not to keep out Mexicans, but to keep out Asians from coming in from Mexico. So it is ingrained, just like white Christianity is, in our national myth. And we haven't come to terms with that. We haven't come to terms not just with other anti-Asian episodes in our history. We always go to Japanese internment because that's the most obvious. Just like when we look at white supremacy, we always go to the Klan and say, oh yeah, we hate those guys. But the legacy, it's different. It's the same thing, I think, with Asian Americans. And I think we at Axios are trying to do that. I have a colleague, Shauna Chen, who's very aggressive. And I'm very proud to say Axios is the only organization right now whose newsroom is led by an Asian American Native Hawaiian woman, an indigenous woman. So with those, you cannot tackle that unless you have somebody in charge of newsrooms and news productions who understand that and whose deep commitment to bring that forward so that we can understand it.
Do we have time to do a couple more? One more?
I'll stand up so y'all can see me. Hi there, my name is Addy. I work here at Ipsos. I'm a senior research manager with the International Social Research Team. Thank you all for coming. This is a very engaging conversation. I wanted to ask about, my background is I'm an Indian Zambian immigrant to the United States, and taxation without representation really hits home for me. What I wanted to ask was about how do we make the conversation about race more complex than, I think Camille, you talked about the monolith. Russell, you talked about almost like, having to pick or choose between, different identities. How do we make the conversation more complex about race? Because, I'm glad that, there's an Indian American who asked the question, because until I came to the United States, I didn't realize how important that third dimension of my identity was, Indian Zambian, and hopefully eventually Indian Zambian American. How do we make that conversation about race more complex, and how do we avoid, what to my eyes at least, white supremacy also ruling that conversation? Russell, you talked about, it's easier to get funding if it's, looks like a monolith, right? It's the Latino funding, so let's keep our differences aside. How do we make sure that the funding happens before we then disperse it? So how do we make the conversation more complex? That's my question to you. Thank you.
I would say that first off is we have to stop this game of called the politics of fighting for crumbs. And we see this in urban areas where Black and Latinos are fighting over a school board race. Who cares? Nothing's gonna change. And so they'll say the most offensive things to each other. And then, and we saw this with Black Lives Matter, as everybody's coming together and everybody has grievances they want to talk about the history. I heard this line constantly said, get in line, get in line. We need to talk about slavery first before we talk about, there's no line to get in, right? When you got to pay your mortgage, you don't tell your mortgage company, get in line, I got to pay this car note first. No, the bills are due all over the place. And we have to start change this conversation that there's a line and our grievances matter first. No, this can be all tackled at the same time. And if we don't do that, what it does is build resentment to each other and nothing gets done. Yes, I can tell you as a Mexican American living in New Mexico that we still have a discussion, we need to talk about slavery. It is our national sin. I'm also around native land and about displacement. That's right there before me. That can also be addressed. Also the legacy of Jim Crow and discrimination after the civil rights. That's also there. But we also need to talk about the Mexican Americans who were displaced and the discrimination and the lynchings of the West that we just don't know about, we don't talk about. And when we bring this up in conversations, because we don't know about it, it immediately comes like, oh, you're bringing up other wounds, you haven't addressed my pain. Because we're so focused on people understanding our own hurt, our own pain. If somebody, a family has yet to get an apology for a lynching in Mississippi, and they're trying to get a plaque or something, it's very hard for them to hold empathy with someone who experienced the same thing in Pueblo, Colorado. I think it's an empathy problem. We cannot take ourselves and put ourselves in other people's shoes. That has to stop. Because if we're a pluralist society, our democracy depends on us putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
I just wanted to add one thing. I know you want to close, but thank you so much for that great question. I'm just going to end on a really positive note. I think this is such a great moment for people to stand up and claim multiple identities, and we should continue to do that. We should continue to form coalitions across a variety of different kinds of identities, and I think we are in a moment where we can do that. One of the things, a couple of months ago, I sat on a panel with the Census Bureau, head of Census Bureau, and we were talking about adding additional categories to the census, which I think is really important because the census conversation kind of drives a lot of other things. And so, I'm just going to say, get involved in those conversations that allow us to claim our multiple identities.
And with that, I would add we could probably do that better as researchers as well, right?
Can I add a point to this point? And the head of the census is whom? A person of color, right?
Right.
I mean, that's the important point.
Right.
Yeah.
That we wouldn't have that conversation if we didn't have people that have different perspectives. Yeah.
Right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This has just been an awesome, awesome conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists today who have all brought just a wonderful perspective to some very difficult questions, but I think the honesty was wonderful. And with that, we have some refreshments in the back. Please stay and have more conversations around this. There's just so much more to be talked about and addressed.